Since at least the mid-20th century, most genres of literary criticism and theory have relied to varying degrees on certain conceptions of narrative structure. In this entry, I'll take a close and critical look at some of these ideas and at some of the surprising conclusions to which they have led narrative theory in general. Most people are familiar with the idea that a story can have a point of view, one that is aligned with one of the characters or voices in the narrative. This point of view is what narratologists call the focalization of the narrative. And this point of focalization can change throughout the story. The term was introduced in the 1960s by the French theorist Gérard Genette, who contributed enormously to our understanding of narrative and its underlying machinery. He used the term external focalization to describe a narrative point of view that is not associated with any character within the narrative, what we usually call the third person and sometimes omniscient narrator. For Genette, this externality becomes evident when a character, quote, performs in front of us without our ever being allowed to know his thoughts or feelings. In his seminal work, Narrative Discourse, he looks at Ernest Hemingway's story Hills Like White Elephants as an example. It is a story which, quote, carries circumspection so far as to become a riddle. Genette writes, but we should not limit this narrative type to a role only in works at the highest literary level. Michel Raymond remarks rightly that in the novel of intrigue or adventure, quote, where interest arises from the fact that there is a mystery, the author does not tell us immediately all that he knows, end quote. So, according to Genette, both Hemingway's story and a whodunit mystery put us in the same epistemological condition because the author has not told us all that he knows about the hero. But how exactly could we ever determine whether there has been full disclosure in Hemingway's story? What information would assure us that everything has been revealed? To answer that question, the critic must unconsciously draw up a contract to designate the question whose answer will then be considered the ultimate revelation. In the contract Genette imposes on Hemingway's story, the designated question is of the thoughts and feelings of the hero. Genette asserts that if an answer to this particular question had been provided by the fiction, the author would have given us, quote, all that he knows, despite the fact that there remain countless other such questions that could just as easily have been the designated one. Genette could have asked about the hero's childhood, his sexual habits, his relationship with his mother, etc., etc. This conception of external focalization requires us to accept as an axiom that Hemingway himself harbors thoughts about his hero that he does not communicate through his story. Setting aside the fact that this certainly might not be true, if Hemingway harbored thoughts that he did not articulate or suggest through ink on his page, or through any ink on any page, which might then become part of the context of his short story, then those thoughts have nothing to do with what the literary work is or what it does. So, in reality, nothing can be withheld from a reader, because a reader has full access to the only thing that constitutes the literary work, that is, the text itself, and presumably any context that might suggest further significance. Genette disagrees. Because Hemingway's fiction leaves questions in our mind, he says, the story is a riddle. And by equating that riddle with the riddle created by a whodunit, he can come to the false conclusion that Hemingway has withheld from us some specific predetermined information. After all, a whodunit, unlike Hemingway's story, really does withhold specific predetermined information that only exists because the text suggests and produces it at the end of the narrative. The whodunit thus enacts what we might call a theater of truth. It manufactures a screen behind which secrets are said to lie, and thus can portray itself as revealing truth when it draws the curtain and reveals the information that is the solution to the mystery. Critics like Genette
who see all literature as engaged in this game of information, look with suspicion upon any fiction that does not play it. They can conclude that a literary work is withholding some truth, and even that it rejects truth and reality in general, if it does not put on this theater of veiling and then unveiling some predetermined data. There are many reasons this issue matters to the history of literary criticism. One of them has to do with a long-standing misconception that many critics harbor about what we now call modernist literature. For reasons I have elaborated elsewhere, literary criticism has long been invested in portraying modernist literature as cryptic, as encased in a subjectivity that is withdrawn from larger realities, and even from truth in general. Jeanette contends that Hemingway's story must be withholding some predetermined but never disclosed information, and this kind of structural truth, so-called, has been very useful to this long-standing critical philosophy. Like Jeanette, the theorist Miki Ball has contributed enormously to refining and clarifying concepts we use to discuss narrative apparatus. And as with Jeanette, metaphysics permeate the narratology she maps out. Her 1997 book, Narratology, discusses, quote, character-bound focalization, which is a point of view in a narrative that is exclusively tied to a single character. A character-bound focalizer, she writes, inevitably brings about bias and limitation in a narrative. As exemplary proof of this premise, Ball points to the Henry James novel What Maisie Knew, in which the narrative expresses only the thoughts and perceptions of a single child. We, the readers, see the world through Maisie's eyes, and although she does not know how to interpret correctly many things she sees and hears, we, the adults, do know how to interpret them. Maisie often does not see the significance of the adult world of love and infidelity, but we do. As in a whodunit, factual mysteries occasionally arise in this story that end up being answered, for the reader at least, by the end of the novel. The essential relevant truth of James's novel is identified by Ball as, quote, what is actually going on, end quote. This truth is then easily determined. It is comprised of whatever facts that have become clear to us, but which Maisie evidently does not know. So, by its conclusion, this novel is no different than any other, in that the text has signaled to the reader everything that it has to signal. But Ball's narratology insists that the Maggie-bound narration submerges us in a world of bias and limitation. As with Jeanette, this view insists that only a narrator with access to some totalizing epistemological comprehension can adequately bear out the knowledge pertaining to that story. And although modern narratology claims to rely no longer on the concept of omniscient narration, that term still perfectly expresses the totalized comprehension that many of its premises can't seem to do without. As a side note, one of the reasons that critics charge modernism in particular with epistemological inadequacy is because modernist works will often ignore the need for omniscient narration. And it is the non-fictional work of Henry James, ironically enough, that was most instrumental in ingraining this view in the annals of literary criticism. What Maisie Knew articulates a series of facts and propositions about its fictional world, about who is having an affair with whom, what a third character has said about it, etc. A finite series of facts and propositions that, by the end of the novel, we understand, but Maisie often does not. For Ball, What Maisie Knew confirms the following narratological principle. Quote, when an external focalizer seems to yield focalization to a character-bound focalizer, what is really happening is that the CF is being given within the all-encompassing vision of the EF. End quote. The metaphysic of this formula, what we might call its narratotheology, is remarkable. It proposes that an external focalizer always exists, even in a novel that never makes use of external focalization. Even if every prepared and encoded signal had been generated through a point of view bound to the girl,
Ball says that the total knowledge thus produced for the reader is necessarily exceeded and encompassed by another external focalization. In much the same way that a theology must trace all phenomena ultimately back to a God, even when the phenomena do not require us to posit a God, the metaphysics of literary structuralism require us to posit that any potential but unarticulated facts about the fictional world are somehow known by some omniscience somewhere, by an all-encompassing vision, as Ball puts it. Take the character of Mad Max in the movie that bears his name. At no point are we told anything about his thoughts about his mother. But that doesn't mean that such thoughts exist in this fictional construct, and that the film is withholding them. Such thoughts just don't exist on any level. Or consider Ahab in Moby Dick. Within his fictional world, that character could be said to have a specific number of hairs on his head, just as we do in the non-fictional world. But Melville's text never articulates or suggests such a number. Does that mean that there really is a specific number of hairs on his head? 5,302, say, but definitely not 5,301, and that the novel simply has kept that information from us? Clearly not. According to narratology, however, there is a definite answer to that question, even if it is never signaled by the text. Why? Because the godlike and ever-present external focalizer would have to know what that answer is. For an example of how these metaphysics animate even literary criticism that seems to have nothing to do with narratology, we can look at the highly regarded work of Frederick Jameson. In The Political Unconscious, Jameson writes about Joseph Conrad's novel Lord Jim. Quote, Conrad's elaborate narrative hermeneutic, what really did happen, who knows it all, what impressions do people have who possess only this piece of the puzzle or that one, tends to reinforce and supply powerful narrative demonstrations of an ideology of the relativity of individual monads. End quote. So because Conrad locates the source of all narratives in human beings instead of a single supernatural omniscience, a situation that simply reflects the condition of narrative in the real world, Jameson says that in doing so, Conrad embodies a relativist ideology. When Jameson discusses individual monads, he's referring to the various characters who narrate events in Lord Jim, Marlowe, Stein, the French lieutenant, etc. After all those narratives have been elaborated, one might ask Jameson if there really is any pertinent fact about Jim's story that the novel leaves in question. Does the reader really end up asking what really did happen about any relevant circumstance in the novel? Isn't the whole point of this fiction that Jim's embattled conscience cannot escape or disguise a set of facts that are known by everyone? As Marlowe reminds us repeatedly about Jim's story, quote, there was no incertitude as to facts. What we see in Jameson's reading of Conrad is another case of forging the signature of modernism on the epistemological contract of the whodunit. The trope of the scattered puzzle is vital to this forgery. What Jameson calls narrative impressions could simply and adequately be depicted as superadditions, stories added to stories, facts to facts, that continually flesh out and further elaborate the events in question. Jameson depicts these abundant narratives instead as pieces or fragments, terms which presume a pre-existing comprehension that has been shattered into inadequate pieces. As with Jeanette and Ball, Jameson thus imposes onto the text his own anxiety about the absence of a univocal authority in Conrad's fiction, a lack that, again, reflects the condition of the real historical world, where there is no such thing as a single supernatural authority enunciating the one true narrative. In Lord Jim, Marlowe recites and comments on narratives he obtained from Jim. As there is no controversy or incertitude as to facts between these two, the differences that might exist between their narratives could only be those of interpretation, of their judgments about those facts. All of the novel's questions, whether they be called existential, ethical, or philosophical, would have remained questions without Marlowe's participation, even if we had obtained these stories from Jim himself, and even if the entirety of the novel had been voiced in third-person omniscience. Contemporary criticism persists, however, with the opposite notion, the idea that the narration of a character necessarily keeps us from certain answers to which we would otherwise have had access. This idea can be attributed partly to the critical metaphor of embedded narration. Whereas Conrad's novel lays out a series of narratives, the image of embedding superimposes onto this series an imaginary activity of receding inward with each new embedding. So although Marlowe's discourse is actually no further from the facts than is a hypothetical narration by Jim or by an external focalizer, this figural movement of ever greater enclosure creates an imaginary immediacy or presence that the subsequent narratives are leaving behind. This depth model, imposed onto the narrative series only by the critic's metaphor of embedding, has led to sweeping philosophical conclusions. As one critic writes, "Heart of Darkness and Lord Jim disclose in narrative structure the relativism of modern epistemology. Conrad's creation of Marlowe and his embedding of Marlowe's narrative within another acknowledge that we always perceive the world many times removed, filtered through our own consciousness and that of others, as through a glass darkly." The image of embedding inevitably leads to its partner, the metaphor of an iteration that has been filtered by a narrating character's consciousness. The law of filtering says that it is a structural necessity that any report of a report must have gone through a fundamental alteration as it passes through the second reporter's mind. The character's mind is conceived as a kind of cheesecloth filtering the narrative, so that not a single aspect of that narrative could emerge without being radically changed. But narratology never interrogates how exactly this filtering operation works. It simply accepts the conclusion that it changes the reported story so radically that it becomes a demonstration of nothing less than, quote, "the relativism of modern epistemology," end quote. But what happens if we do ask basic questions about this filtering process? For instance, filtering implies that something has been filtered out. But what, exactly? Has Marlowe's report of Jim's story filtered out any facts? His judgments about those facts? His tone? But then we arrive at a more fundamental question. What could it possibly mean to suggest that there are specific facts about Jim's story that no reader could ever possibly know, since what we have is Marlowe's report and not Jim's? For the reasons I set out earlier, it is incoherent to posit the existence of hidden facts or judgments or tones that are never signaled in any way by the text of the novel. What is really telling, however, is that the moment narratology utters this filtering metaphor, it has abandoned its own charter. Remember that the promise of narratology at its birth was that it offers objective structural tools of analysis that are not dependent on the vagaries of mere interpretation. As Jeanette writes, quote, "That which has to do with interpretation does not lie within the province of narratology," end quote. It is true that many contemporary narratologists do not embrace this statement categorically. But narratology does continue to propose that it isolates objective or structural features of a text which remain distinct from any interpretation that would be subsequent. The very ology in its name presupposes this ability to separate the science from the art of literary criticism. And as we've seen, the concept of a filtered narration is presented as a necessary consequence of the so-called structural fact of embedded narration. But in reality, this filtering is entirely dependent on the wildest interpretive assumptions. It depends first and foremost on the idea that a fictional character really does have an operating consciousness that exists over and above whatever the text does or does not propose about it, and that this fictional consciousness has the power to determine the objective narratological constitution of the novel. Secondly, the filtering operation depends equally on a sweeping interpretation of human psychology in general, and takes it as an indisputable fact that a person can never reiterate another person's narrative in an epistemologically adequate way. In short, the tropes of embedding and filtering always presuppose psychological interpretations of fictional characters. The fact that the metaphysics of embedding and filtering are inventions of the critic, and not endemic to any fiction, is demonstrable in their starkly inconsistent use by narratology and by literary criticism in general. When they turn their attention to the earliest English novels, for instance, novels like Samuel Richardson's Pamela, whose letter-writing heroine frequently reiterates stories she obtained from other characters, literary critics never claim that these narratives are not to be trusted because they have been, quote, filtered through Pamela's consciousness. No critic has ever supposed that this novel harbors some secret information that Pamela's consciousness has kept from our view. And yet the narratological structures in Pamela are identical to those in Lord Jim. This inconsistency makes clear that the reason critics see epistemological troubles in modernists like Conrad is not, as they claim, because such troubles necessarily emerge from their narrative structures. Their conclusions are based rather on an unacknowledged historical interpretation. The assumption is that any post-Victorian fiction that does not play the epistemological game of the whodunit is necessarily infused with, quote, the relativism of modern epistemology, end quote. My argument here is against the often unacknowledged structuralist pretensions of literary criticism. I don't suggest, however, that the trope of embedded narration cannot illuminate a good old-fashioned interpretation of a fiction. When you're looking at a novel whose various narratives are arranged with the rigorous symmetry of nesting dolls, that arrangement becomes a gesture, a theme, and just as much an object of attention as anything in the fictional world. The structuralist impulse, however, combined with the desire to see themes of subjective enclosure in modernist fiction, often leaves critics perceiving such gestures where they don't exist. The astute Peter Brooks, for instance, has given us instructive narratological analyses of Conrad's Heart of Darkness. But Brooks's reading depends heavily on the idea that the story is structured by symmetrical frame narratives, what he calls brackets. In a footnote, however, he acknowledges that upon close examination, quote, we realize that the diagram is false. The inner frame of Kurtz's narrative has no such shapely coherence, and, perhaps as a consequence, neither Marlowe's narrative nor the first narrator's appears to close in satisfactory fashion. End quote. That is an extraordinary statement. Heart of Darkness does not bother to create the symmetrical arrangement that a structuralist would like to see. The absence of this gesture, Brooks says, might have consequential power over the other narratives in the novel. In this case, the lack of symmetry in Kurtz's narrative has somehow disrupted the symmetry that the other narratives, quote, should have had. Structural symmetry is seen not as a gesture that a novelist does or does not choose to make, but rather as an independent power that exerts influence even where it does not exist. This is a commonplace in literary criticism. Faced with a writing that does not happen to be interested in structuralist metaphors, the critic avers that such writing has perversely thwarted a structural regime to which it should naturally conform. If a fiction fails to conform to structuralist metaphors, the story goes, it is deliberately rebelling against a regulation that is both a norm and an obligation. As everywhere it is applied in the humanities and social sciences, structuralism in literary studies has a split consciousness. It begins by acknowledging its metaphors as inventions, as descriptive tools merely. but it ends by conceiving its structural metaphors as a kind of DNA that operates within a work of literature, guiding, constraining, and ultimately determining its development. The structuralist forgets his constructions and then imagines them to be realities external to his invention. Thank you for watching, and as always, please don't hesitate to leave comments or questions.